Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. We have some new news out of the ACC. Clemson has filed their own lawsuit, joining Florida State in that movement against the ACC. Then we're going to get into some spring questions. Spring football starting all over the country. Want to get you guys updated on all the things to watch as it kind of unfolds. Then we're going to get back to some of the best games in 2024. We break down week 0 through 4 up to this point. So if you want to check out those segments, definitely do that. They're on the YouTube page. But we're going to get to 5 and 6 today, and they are just incredible weeks with tons of marquee matchups. Then we're going to finish off the show with another Spotlight Wednesday, and today we are going to talk about the Utah Utes, a ton riding on this season as they roll into the Big 12. Some playoff aspirations for this team, but it all rides on one very, very big factor, which I will get into. But before we start, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to see your questions on the screen and we can have a fun back and forth, or I can answer something that you're wondering about a certain topic, the best way to do that is to get your questions on the screen using the link on the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to see your name, your question on the screen, and maybe I can answer it and we can have a fun back and forth here. Again, that's gsmcpodcast.net. All right, let's jump right in because it has been an eventful 24 hours. The ACC has kind of been fighting this battle with Florida State for a couple months now, and it felt like everything was starting to kind of come to a head, right? We've been talking about it in previous weeks where Florida State feels like they're starting to kind of pick up momentum. They feel like they kind of have the ACC on the ropes, if you will, and Clemson seems to think so as well because they have joined Florida State. They have sued the ACC regarding their grant of rights, mainly regarding the withdrawal rules and the enforceability of those rules, and the just ridiculous sum that they would have to pay to leave the conference, which we will get to here in a second. But Clemson's main argument in this lawsuit is that the ACC is preventing the university from pursuing a wide range of strategic alternatives that may be necessary for its continued success in the college athletics and as an institution. So essentially, the ACC, they feel, is kind of holding them back from being able to explore all the options, whether that's the SEC or the Big Ten or any other conference. Essentially, they're just saying that their contract they have with the ACC, their grant of rights, is just too restrictive, and they should be able to essentially come and go as they please the way it is in some other conferences. So, as I talked about earlier, the big gripe here is just how much they would have to pay out of pocket to the ACC to actually leave the conference. And they have a real good leg to stand on here because when you look at the rest of the conferences, the Big Ten has no withdrawal fee at all. So you can leave for absolutely for free. The Big 12 essentially is just you do not get the revenue split for the final 2 years of your time in the Big 12. So Texas and Oklahoma just went through this. They essentially just have to forfeit that amount of money for the final 2 years if they want to leave the conference. And then the SEC is $30 million for if you give a 2-year notice before leaving the conference, $40 million for less than 2 years, and then $45 million for no notice. And the ACC is right between 130 and 140. I've seen different reports with that number. I think 130 is the number for Florida State, but I've seen 140 thrown out there for Clemson. So obviously there's a huge disparity in those numbers. And I will say, to be totally fair to the ACC, the Big 12 and the SEC have more power to allow for those rules to be a little bit more lenient in that way because not a lot of people are trying to leave the Big Ten and the SEC, let's be honest. So the Big Ten can let them leave for free. They can do that no problem because the Big Ten's not really worried about any of their guys up and leaving in the next couple of years unless they ask them to. So I don't think they're too worried about that. The same thing with the SEC. So these guys can charge a little bit less, but also the number for the ACC is exorbitant. It's a little bit ridiculous. It's kind of insane. And I think one of the big reasons for it is the ACC in 2016 signed this media deal with ESPN, and on face value, it's a good idea to keep your media deals up to date, to keep your media deals moving with the times. The ACC gave themselves pretty much no chance to do that because their media deal ran for 20 years, so it runs through 2036. So there's not really an ability to catch up with the money that the SEC or the Big Ten is making, because you set yourself in this set agreement for how much you're going to be making year over year for the next 20 years. So you don't necessarily have the ability to adjust with the times, to keep up with everyone else, because you've locked yourself in. So funnily enough, the thing that should have probably helped the ACC stay, stable for the next 20 years and be a cohesive unit has probably signed their death note, honestly. I think this is something that all of the schools across the ACC are not happy about. I think it's something that a lot of schools are starting to take more and more notice of and realize it's ridiculous that all of these other schools are signing new media deals every 5 or 7 years for just crazy payouts, where in the Big Ten it's $100 million per school, in the SEC it's $60 million, in the ACC it's somewhere around, I think, 35 to 40. I could be slightly off on that number, but just in general, that $40 million is pretty much stagnant. There could be some type of adjustment throughout the time, but it's not going to adjust the same way that media has adjusted to sports, because as we know, it's changed insane amounts. Even in the the past decade, it's been insane amounts of media money being pumped into the sport, being pumped into pretty much every single sport, and ad deals and everything like that. So it was pretty much impossible for them to keep up if they were to sign themselves into a 20-year deal, and that's exactly what they did. So a little bit of a mess created by the ACC that is now turning its ugly head, because Florida State is already in a lawsuit with the ACC. There's actually 2 lawsuits, Florida State against the ACC, that is being tried in Florida, the ACC against Florida State because they countersued in North Carolina, and now we've added Clemson suing the ACC in South Carolina. So 3 different suits for the ACC to deal with, 2 different big-time names in their conference, because I think, as we've talked about in the playoff discussions, there was a little bit of an edge above the ACC compared to the Big 12 when you talk about revenue distribution. So they got about, I think, 17%, while the Big 12 got around 15, maybe a little bit below 15%. So a big reason for that is Florida State and Clemson. Let's be honest. Those are the 2 big-time brands that are kind of pulling the ACC along. Miami does a huge part in that, North Carolina as well. But those 2 schools, Florida State and Clemson, the 2 schools that you are now fighting with, are a big reason that you are as viable of a conference as you are. So there does become a little bit of an issue. If you let these guys walk and you take down the grant of rights and you allow them to either walk for free or a much discounted rate, as Clemson obviously wants and Florida State as well, I think you could open the floodgates, right? There's a ability for a ton of different schools across that conference to buy out if you give them that opportunity, right? So that $140 million or $130 million, that insane number that they're, demanding from these schools to do, it creates a little bit more of an incentive for the smaller schools to stay around, or at the very least to stay out of these court cases, because it is not necessarily worth their time, worth their financial budget, as long as Florida State and Clemson are on the front lines, as long as the big guys are taking care of that. If the things fall the team's way, then other people will follow, and I think that's something that's going to happen here pretty shortly. Miami and North Carolina have been kind of lurking on the outside of all of this. They've been sitting, just kind of waiting to hear more news, what's going on with everything, and slowly more stuff has come out. I think it was mostly just them hedging on the idea, the very unlikely chance that Florida State does lose their case to the ACC and they are stuck in the conference, and you don't want to be on the wrong side of history if you are in those discussions. So I think there's a certain level of Miami and North Carolina and everyone else really just kind of waiting it out, waiting to see where the winds are shifting type of thing, and then jump in. And Clemson obviously feels confident enough in Florida State's case against the ACC, or just feel confident enough that they need to do something as well, that they have jumped into the fire, and now it looks like Miami and North Carolina could be very shortly behind. I saw Andy Staples was talking about on his show with Pete Nakos about all of this, and Miami and North Carolina have been interested in this for quite some time. Let's put it that way. They've been kind of watching this very, very closely, and with Clemson joining in, with Florida State not being the only school out there on its island, it's very possible that these two schools join in. And if Miami, I think, would be the more likely to join in immediately, partly because North Carolina is in the same state as the ACC headquarters, would create a little bit of a problem there. But if Miami jumps in, and especially North Carolina, because of that dynamic, the ACC will just be drowning in court cases. And that is something that the ACC has plenty of money. They're not necessarily hurting in the pocketbooks, but to be totally fair, there's only so much you can take. There's only so many, court filings. There's only so much money that can be poured into these cases before you kind of have to throw your hands up and say, okay, you guys won. And it would really, really stink to see that happen. But at the end of the day, it feels like we're on this kind of slippery slope where more and more ACC teams are seeing the conference as vulnerable, first of all, in these court cases, is seeing that the conference is not keeping up with the rest of the college football world, which is obviously a huge problem, and they see an opening. And the opening is essentially, if we don't take it now, where are we sitting in 5 years if we stay in the ACC? And I think that's a big question on everyone's mind, because Miami joins, North Carolina joins, maybe Virginia joins the fight. If all of those guys jump out of the conference, there are more behind them, I promise. Whether it's, Pittsburgh going to the Big 12, or Georgia Tech going to the Big 12 or the SEC, or a million different teams that North Carolina State could go to the Big 12. There are tons of teams that will find a new place to play football because, as we talked about earlier, you take out Miami, North Carolina, Clemson, Florida State, you take out a big reason that the ACC outpaced the Big 12 in the revenue distribution deals. You lose essentially all the legs to stand on in those discussions, and you become a group of five type conference that just has to take what is given to them and say thank you and move on. So it's obviously not what any of us want, but it could be the road that we're heading down, with more and more of these cases piling up and more of a financial burden being put on the ACC. And the question is now, what does the ACC do from here? And I think it's pretty much just damage control time. I think if there was always a chance that they were going to beat out Florida State and be able to work something out to where maybe only Florida State leaves, or maybe they only lose a couple of guys up top, or maybe they could work something out where they could stay afloat. But with more and more people joining the fray, Clemson now, I think UNC and Miami are likely not short behind, but we'll see what happens there. It's going to be really hard to stay viable as a big-time conference, and you're probably going to have to backfill a little bit if you want to stay a conference. So that means going into the American and getting some teams. That means going into the Sun Belt, especially, I think, whether it's Troy or App State. Going into Conference USA, you can snag some teams from there. So there are some options out there. It's obviously not ideal. It's not the same situation the Big 12 was in, where they could backload from the Pac-12, but you can do something. You can add Oregon State and Washington State back into the fray. You can do a number of things, but right now it looks like we are down a road that essentially we cannot come back from at this point. It sounds like the ACC days are numbered, and at least as we know it today, and hopefully they can figure out a good plan quickly, because I think teams are leaving. I think they're leaving pretty quickly, and you're going to need some options coming in the back door. So we'll figure out what all of that means going forward. We'll definitely get updates on this court case, and we'll get updates on some more, I'm sure, pretty soon. So keep up to date with all of that type of stuff. It is going to be a crazy ride. So we will have, I'm sure, a number of segments throughout or the end of this week into next week about all of this stuff and the fallout. But for now, we're going to take our first break, and when we come back, we're going to get into some spring questions. Spring football is starting all over the country. There are tons of teams to watch, tons of narratives to watch across the country as well, so we will get to that right after this break, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the face, yeah. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient. Hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing. Sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown. Get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, it's stupid. If you choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the new developments with the ACC. Clemson has now joined Florida State in suing the ACC, and a lot of things are going to happen very quickly on that front, so we will keep you up to date there. But now it's time for spring questions. We have done this before. We have done 2 segments of this thus far, and you can definitely check out the YouTube page for those. Some very interesting things going on all around the country during spring that they're going to need some answers to. But let's go with a little bit more broad scope with some of these questions today. And we'll start with one that kind of spurred an idea I saw on the Josh Pate podcast, where they were talking about QB battles and how there's not really a lot to be found across the country. There are some that are kind of lurking under the surface, but where are they going to come from and which ones are going to be the most consequential is still very, very questionable. And I got 4 teams here that could have QB battles. I don't necessarily expect them to, but I think there are definitely some guys that could contest for that top spot. So let's start with Ohio State. There are a lot of people that are a little bit bullish about Will Howard, a little bit, think he's the guy, think he's going to roll right in and win the job, and I tend to believe that's the case. I think he's a better quarterback. I think he has more experience under his belt compared to Devin Brown, and I think he just checks the boxes that Kyle McCord did not a year ago, which is a huge win for Ohio State, obviously. But Devin Brown's sitting right there, and he has made it abundantly clear that he is not running away from any challenge. He is honestly becoming one of my favorite players in the country because the dude is consistent. He wakes up every day, goes to work, works his butt off, and lets the chips fall where they may. So I think he's someone that, in a world where a lot of guys would have found another place to play right now, Devin Brown is cut from a little bit of a different cloth. But I still expect Will Howard to be the guy here, and I expect him to kind of assert that throughout the spring, but a lot can happen. And obviously that spring game is going to be very, very interesting. I believe it's on April 13th, if I'm not mistaken, so that's definitely something to watch. Devin Brown is more than talented, but Will Howard definitely does have the experience factor there. Another kind of the same situation is in Oregon. They brought in Dillon Gabriel and brought in Dante Moore from the portal, an absolute embarrassment of riches in that quarterback room in the 2 deep, and Dillon Gabriel is likely going to win this job. I think this one's actually one of the more straightforward, partly because when Dante Moore came over to Oregon, he made it pretty clear that he was set to sit behind Dillon Gabriel for a year, learn from the, crazy amounts of experience that Dillon Gabriel has, and learn from a lot of the things that he struggled with a year ago in taking care of the ball, putting the ball on time, on target. Those are things that Dillon Gabriel does almost perfectly. So you can learn a ton under 1 year of Dillon Gabriel, and then 2025 you burst onto the scene and become one of the best quarterbacks in the country. So I think that one's a little bit more straightforward, but who knows? With all of the new changes to college football, especially the helmet comms, it definitely does benefit those really talented young players over some of the veterans in some cases. So this could be a case where that happens. Auburn is another one. I think this one's a little bit interesting because it's pretty much Peyton Thorne against the field. He had a year last year that was, up and down, not necessarily what Auburn fans were expecting, but he will have a lot better of a group to work with. Obviously, bringing in Cam Coleman and Perry Thomas, two very, very talented freshman wide receivers that I think are going to be huge to start with. But Peyton Thorne, I would venture to say, is not necessarily Hugh Freeze's perfect quarterback. I think he would definitely has another guy in the wings right now that he expects to be the one that brings Auburn and him to kind of that next level, and I think that's Walker White, the guy that just walked in as a freshman, very, very talented, has just insane arm talent. So if Peyton Thorne starts to struggle early in the season, because I do think it will be Peyton Thorne at least in week 1, but is it him in week 13 will be something to watch, because there have been times last year where he did not look great. It is not an easy schedule, as it always is for Auburn in the SEC. So if he stumbles, I would not be surprised if he let the freshman go on out there and get some work under his belt before his sophomore season in 2025, where things could really, really open up. And then finally, let's go to Michigan, because this one's a little bit interesting. Alex Orji had plenty of playing time last year, but it was all situational, right? It was all running situations where the second he stepped on the field, you knew exactly what they were doing, although they were running most of the time anyway. So he's someone that definitely is sitting above the pack right now. I think he is the leader in the clubhouse, but there are a couple of guys behind him that could definitely make a push. I think Jack Tuttle is one that is a little bit closer to the J.J. McCarthy type quarterback than Alex Orji is. Obviously not nearly as athletic, not nearly as dynamic outside of the pocket, but Jack Tuttle has a lot of football under his belt, can put the ball where it needs to be when it needs to be there, and that's the Michigan mantra, right? That's all you really need to do to win a ton of games in Ann Arbor, so he could definitely be an option if Orji does struggle throughout the spring. But another guy, Jaden Davis, just came in as a freshman, and I think he's someone that it probably will not be week 1 where we see Jaden Davis, but it could very well be later in the year, like that Auburn situation with Walker White, where you see that Alex Orji or Jack Tuttle are not the answers at quarterback, and Jaden Davis might as well get him some reps in his freshman year as he goes into becoming the future quarterback for the Wolverines. So a lot of things to watch there. I think for the most part, I think the odds-on favorite right now will probably win out in most of these scenarios, but it doesn't mean they're going to be playing the whole season. So still a ton to watch in all of those different places. And throughout spring, those spring games will give us a very interesting insight where these guys get to go head-to-head, which will be really, really fun. Another one going into spring is who of the new crop of the Big 12 teams is going to take advantage of this the most. I think coming off the year that the Pac-12 just had, obviously a remarkably good year for the conference, Texas and OU leaving the Big 12 leaves a little bit of a void there for someone up at the top to kind of assert their dominance. Kansas State obviously has won titles in the past and is the on-odds favorite to win the conference this upcoming year, but two teams coming over from the Pac-12 will have plenty to say about that. Utah and Arizona are two teams that are kind of coming off different seasons. Utah a little bit disappointing with Cam Rising not being as healthy as they would have liked, obviously. But if he is healthy, Utah will absolutely be hard to beat. They can do a ton of different things, but we'll get into them a little bit later in the show in more depth. And then Arizona, obviously coming off a huge year, but Jed Fish did move on to a new place, but the quarterback didn't join him. Noah Fafita and Tatoria McMillan, the incredible wide receiver quarterback duo there, are still in town. They are still a part of the Wildcat family, so I think it's very interesting that they were able to keep those guys around. They lost some guys on defense. The new head coach is always a question mark, but when you have the quarterback in place, you can do a lot of different things. So Arizona should be right in the mix for the Big 12 this upcoming year. Colorado is the really interesting one here, as they always are. They are a team that could really struggle, in my eyes, in their first year of the Big 12, or they could set the world on fire. And I think it comes down to the offensive line. It comes down to kind of mundane parts of the game that they just weren't quite as good at a year ago as, the big-time teams that they ended up playing. Run and pass blocking were a huge problem. That offensive line just needs to be better. Jordan Seaton, the freshman, needs to be a huge part of that. Penalties were another huge part where they shot themselves in the foot a lot. Some time management problems in certain games. So a lot of the mundane parts of the game are the ways that Colorado needs to get better, and how much they get better will determine how much of a threat they really are in the grand picture of the Big 12. And then finally, Arizona State. I think this is one that will take a little bit of time. I think Kenny Dillingham is actually building something there that will be relatively sustainable in the Big 12. I think he is bringing in more talent. I think he is obviously does a great job with quarterbacks. We saw him at Oregon before taking this job a year ago. And then Jaden Rashada going into his second year as the majority starter. There were some iffy times last year, but he is still a very talented kid. And with Kenny Dillingham at his side, they could do a lot of things. So although I don't think Arizona State will be competing for the conference in any way this upcoming year, I think they could ruin some people's chances to compete for the conference and go to the playoff, because they're a very sneaky team in that conference going into this year. And then let's get into the ACC, because there is a big question surrounding the ACC that I think is becoming more and more prevalent pretty much every day, especially after last year, and is the ACC really just Florida State and everyone else? Is Florida State going to continue to kind of assert their dominance over the conference like they did a year ago? Obviously, still a ton of building that needs to happen under Mike Norvell, but this year could be a huge year for them, because you kind of, set the ACC on notice last year. Can you solidify it this year and kind of become that team? I think is a big question. And then there's so many teams right behind them that are going to be very, very in the conversation when we talk about the ACC overall. Obviously, Clemson is the front of that line. A lot of people would argue they are still right up there with Florida State. I think they're very, very close. I think I'm a little bit nervous just with the current direction of the program and kind of the way they're going about business, mainly in recruiting, but I still think Clemson is the team that is going to be the biggest threat to Florida State going forward. There's also Miami, Louisville, NC State, and SMU coming in from the American this upcoming year. All of those teams are dangerous. All of those teams could push Florida State. And I think there's a big question of if anyone can really challenge Florida State on the defensive side of the ball. They have so many guys, definitely a ton of guys leaving, mainly, Jared Verse and Braden Fisk on the defensive line. Huge guys to leave, but they've replaced pretty well, and they should be really, really talented on that side of the ball. So if anyone can catch up with them there, then they will have a really, really good opportunity. Clemson obviously will have that chance to beat Florida State. They just have to travel to Tallahassee to do it. Lost in overtime at Clemson a year ago, so definitely some a bad taste in their mouth, definitely some bad blood there. So I think Clemson will come in ready for that game, but if they can knock them off, then the ACC will get a major shakeup about halfway through the season. And then let's get into some teams that might be being overlooked going into this spring, or at least teams that have some big questions that will go a long way to be answering during spring. And let's start with the Oklahoma Sooners. Jackson Arnold is absolutely the key to this offense, but The problem with Jackson Arnold is he is behind an offensive line that has a lot of question marks. There are some worries across this team with the offensive line. Tons of guys have left, Caden Green being chief among them. There are tons of question marks all the way across that line, and if they can't get them figured out very quickly, then Jackson Arnold might not have the year that Oklahoma fans are hoping from him. And then Brent Venables' defense is starting to kind of take shape out there in Norman, starting to become a little bit more of what he's expecting. Can they kind of match the SEC pace of things and be the defense that he's been kind of slowly building there the last couple of years and continue that upward trend that they started a year ago? Another team is USC. They have probably the biggest question you can have in college football, which is, can you change the culture, which is something that is not easy to do. Lincoln Riley, as we know, has been a run-and-gun guy. He has always been, we're going to outscore our opponent, and they're going to score a ton of points on us, and that is something that it works for the time being, but once you play the big boys, it gets really tough because you're going to need to hit them. You're going to need to hit them hard, and you're going to need to hit them repeatedly, and if you can't match that intensity, it's going to be a problem. So he's trying to figure that out. He's trying to become a more physical team, work on strength and conditioning more focused, be a little bit more tougher. All of those things need to happen, and they need to happen relatively quickly for Lincoln Riley to keep in the good graces of Trojan fans. So it'll be interesting to see how all of that kind of unfolds. I think he's more than up to the task, but it's got to happen pretty quickly. And if it does happen quickly, then things get interesting in LA very fast. But another team real quick is Penn State. And the question is, can Drew Aller be the guy? Can he take that step forward that everyone saw in spurts last year, but never really quite fully took the reins? If he can take that step forward, if he can be that guy and really look the part in spring, I think a lot of Penn State fans will get very excited about this upcoming season. And then Julian Fleming, can he step in from Ohio State and step into that wide receiver one role with no problem? And can they get a big potent passing attack? Because that's something they've obviously been missing at Penn State over the past couple of years. And Julian Fleming is a step in the right direction, but if he's not going to assert himself as the number one guy, it could be a little bit tougher to make that work. And then Oregon, finally, can Oregon take that next step going into the Big Ten this upcoming year? They have been a team that has been slowly building under Dan Lanning the last couple of years. We're inches away from beating Washington both times that they matched up. And if they had, they would have been in New Orleans against Texas for a chance to go to the national title. So this team did not miss by much. There's tons of new faces in the room. Obviously, the quarterback room we talked about, but tons of new guys on defense, tons of guys in the back end of that defense especially. Can they hold up is going to be a huge part of this. I think this is really just, can Dan Lanning continue to put it all together? Can he continue to build the team that he wants to build? I've dubbed them kind of an SEC team all the way out in the Pacific Northwest. Can he continue to build that type of persona? And it's going to be against a tougher schedule. You do have Ohio State on the schedule, so it'll be interesting to see how all of that kind of unfolds. I think they're up to the task, but it's a lot of pressure on their shoulders for sure in their first year in the Big Ten. But right now, we are going to take our second break of the show, and when we come back, we're going to talk some games. We're going to talk about the best games in Week 5 and 6 of the 2024 season. We've done 2 iterations of this already, where we went through Week 0 through Week 2, and then Week 3 and Week 4. So definitely go check those out. But we're going to get into Week 5 and Week 6 right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the biggest questions going into spring. We have done 2 of those before. This was part 3, so definitely check out all of those if you haven't already. And then let's get back into some games because this is my favorite thing to talk about. It's always fun to go through the schedule of this upcoming year and see all the games we are going to get to experience in 2024. And we're to week 5 and 6, and there are some absolute doozies in this group, so very, very excited. This is the part of the year where Heisman candidates start to emerge, some surprise teams start to pop up, and the season really, really starts to take shape, so you gotta love this time of year. And let's jump right in. We have tons of people to watch. We have tons of games to watch. And let's start in week 5, and let's start with the ACC. Virginia Tech at Miami. That is a Friday game, so you get a fun little standalone game, and kind of an underrated QB battle here. We've talked about Cam Ward a ton on this show, but Kyron Drones is someone that we have not talked about nearly enough. He is someone that kind of made a name for himself last year, burst onto the scene a little bit, but definitely has a ton more to prove and could be a person that makes a huge difference in the ACC race. On Miami, their defense is going to be tested. Kyron Drones does not make it easy on you, can use his legs and his arms, so they will definitely be up to a big-time challenge in that week. And Ruben Bain is someone that I'm definitely going to be watching early on in the season for Miami and in this game because I think these are the games and the weeks that he could start to play himself into that ACC Defensive Player of the Year type conversations because of just how good he is, coming off a remarkable freshman year with I think 7 sacks. Just could explode this year. Would be just an incredible thing for Miami and would help them just tremendously as they go into this 2024 campaign. If Miami does win this game, I think these are the group of games, the Virginia Techs, the Georgia Techs, the teams that they should beat hypothetically, but once you get on the field, all of that needs to be decided, and if they can win those games, they are a team that could absolutely challenge for the ACC with just a couple of wins and a couple of really key games for them. Let's move right on to A&M versus Arkansas. This is a game we saw a year ago, A&M getting the 34-22 win in Jerry World, and that's where this one will be as well. I think Connor Wegman is the guy to watch in this game. He is someone that has a lot riding on his shoulders this upcoming year, coming off a year with some injury trouble, some different things that popped up throughout the year, but he is very talented. He can definitely pull off a number of really, really incredible things, and he has a chance to make a name for himself very, very quickly. They play Notre Dame in the first week. They play Florida in, I think, week 3, if I'm not mistaken, and then they have this game in week 5. So he could absolutely burst onto the scene and possibly be even a Heisman dark horse if he could, play well in those games and kind of put his name on the map, as it were. Let's continue down the road here. Louisville at Notre Dame. Notre Dame does have Texas A&M to start the season, as we just talked about. If they lose that game, this game becomes massive. Louisville is breaking in a new quarterback in Tyler Shuck, the transfer from Texas Tech, and he's going to be tested in this game because Notre Dame defenses under Marcus Freeman, they're going to be good. There's no two ways about that. So he's going to be tested in this game. This is a game that Louisville is going to have to really, really lock in for, and if they can win this, then we could be seeing a repeat of the 2023 season where they made quite the run at the ACC title. And then Riley Leonard obviously going up against a Louisville defense that is not going to give him a lot, so this will be an interesting first couple of tests for him against A&M and then against Louisville. And then we get to the main event of this week, the one that everyone is looking forward to even now, Georgia at Alabama. This is just incredible. It's very rare that we get these type of games. The last time that they played was in 2020 in that COVID year when Georgia went to Bama and got honestly kind of taken to the woodshed, 41-24. I know there are a lot of UGA players that have a bad taste in their mouth after that one, so they're ready to get back to Tuscaloosa. The one big thing in that was there were not a lot of fans in the crowd. That was the COVID year, so definitely a different atmosphere that they're walking into. And then the big talking point that everyone's going to love walking into the game is Jalen Milroe against Carson Beck. Milroe was able to get the first battle. He was able to get number one, round one against Carson Beck in the SEC championship. Can he get round two in Tuscaloosa? It's just going to be incredible. Cannot wait for that game in this week overall. And then we'll jump into Kentucky at Ole Miss. This is kind of an underrated matchup. I think at face value, a lot of you would go, Ole Miss is going to win this game and keep it moving. But Ole Miss should walk into this game undefeated. They don't play a ton of big-time challenges before this game. Kentucky does have UGA before this, so I expect one loss on the board before they get into this game, but still a lot riding on this game. Two teams that really want to be in the conversation for the SEC, maybe one of those at-large bids, maybe even find their way to Atlanta. I know a lot of people are picking Ole Miss to do that, so this would be a game from both point of views that would be absolutely huge to pick up. Kentucky, especially with that game at UGA prior. If they somehow win it, then this game becomes even bigger and a absolute, possibly even game day over Georgia, Alabama, although that'd be really, really tough to beat. But then Brock Vandagriff gets absolutely thrown into the fire to start his career as a Kentucky Wildcat. Trips to Athens and Oxford are not ideal, to say the least. And then to finish it out here, we have Oklahoma at Auburn. This is Oklahoma's first away game as an SEC team, and Jackson Arnold is another guy that is getting thrown into the fire. He plays a couple of really, really tough games. They have Tennessee coming to Norman. They also have Tulane coming to Norman, which is an underrated possible upset alert for the Sooners there. But then walking into Jordan-Hare is a totally different beast. It is incredibly hard to play there, one of the toughest places to play in the entire country, and it'll be interesting to see how he can kind of handle that, because he is still young, still starting for his first year, so I'm definitely going to be watching him with a lot of interest, and definitely trying to figure out what his future, especially this season, looks like, because this season or this game specifically will tell us a lot. And then Auburn's kind of in a little precarious situation. They, no one really knows what to expect from Auburn this upcoming year. There's still a lot of stuff up in the air, but if they could steal with this one, there is a lot of momentum, and they're going into a matchup the following week, as you can see, against Georgia that we'll get to. So momentum could be a huge part of this. And then a couple other games this week. Florida State at SMU is an interesting one. First ACC game for SMU, and Florida State heading to Dallas for a conference game has got to be a little bit of a weird feeling. And then North Carolina and at Duke. A very interesting matchup for a number of reasons. Obviously a rivalry, but Max Johnson and Malik Murphy will be going at it. So a battle of transfer quarterbacks, one from Texas A&M, one from Texas. So from one rivalry to another, these quarterbacks, and it'll be very interesting to watch those guys play on the big stage for, I think, the first time in that season for those teams. Not a ton of big-time matchups in the first couple of weeks. And then in week 6, this is a very interesting week, and it starts with a national championship rematch. Michigan heads to Washington to play out west for the first time in their new Big Ten digs. They play USC at home, but then have to travel out to the Pacific Northwest to take on Washington. And this one's interesting because likely Michigan should win. Washington's in kind of a weird spot, and no one really knows what to expect, but sometimes that's a benefit, and we saw what Jed Fish did at Arizona a year ago. We know what Will Rogers is capable of doing with the football, so maybe this is a game that Washington could take the world by storm and get a little bit of a revenge for the national title a year ago. Another game in the Big Ten this upcoming year, Iowa at Ohio State, and this game really is just, does Iowa have an offense now, is the main question that I have going into this game. Tim Lester, the new OC, has a ton of experience calling plays, I believe 12 years of being an offensive coordinator, so you're bringing in a guy that knows what he's doing at the very least, but it's been a long time since Iowa's had a really potent offense, and so we'll see what happens there. if they can put it together, then maybe this game is a little bit more marquee than we're expecting right now. But Ohio State should win this game. I'm more looking at, can they assert their dominance? Can they kind of impose their will on Iowa and become the team that everyone expects them to be, which is the top of the Big Ten? It'll hold a lot of weight, but also this is right before a trip to Eugene to play Oregon, so maybe a little bit of a look-ahead spot. So we'll get to all that, obviously, as that game approaches more and more, but definitely an interesting game in Week 6. Then we'll get to another Big Ten game. All of these new Big Ten games are throwing me off, but UCLA at Penn State. UCLA traveling all the way to State College from LA for a weekend trip is just ridiculous. They play Oregon earlier in the year, but this is the first time they play a new team in their conference, so a very interesting matchup here, and this is a game where Drew Aller should be able to roll. This is the game where if he's taken a substantial step forward, the step forward that we are, or at least some of us are expecting of him, I know I am, this is the game that he would go out, throw for a couple of touchdowns and 300 yards and really kind of show that he's taken that big step forward. If he struggles in these games, the games against USC in LA, the game against Wisconsin at Wisconsin, and then Ohio State at home become a lot more precarious. But if he can light the world on fire in this game, if he can throw for 300 yards, 3 touchdowns, whatever the numbers are, if he can have a really good day, then all those games down the road that are going to be tough become a little bit more comfortable for Penn State fans. So I think this is a big point for Drew Aller, along with that West Virginia game early in the year, to kind of set his year off and show people what he's really worth and what he's kind of worked on throughout the offseason. So that'll be very interesting to watch. Another game that is always fun to watch is Auburn against Georgia. But Auburn's got to travel to Athens for this one, and that is never an easy proposition for the Tigers. So Auburn, we talked about it a second ago, if Auburn can beat OU at home, they're going to have a lot of momentum going into this game. Maybe Peyton Thorne has a little bit of swagger to his step. Maybe he's starting to roll, and it's going to be very interesting because these 2 weeks for Peyton Thorne are huge. If he struggles against Oklahoma and then struggles even more against Georgia, there could be a new quarterback coming in for the Tigers, because there really wouldn't be much of a reason to roll with Peyton Thorne if you're not winning those type of games, or at least not competing at the level that you should. So the Oklahoma game is going to be huge. It'll be the first time Peyton Thorne's really under a microscope, but this game at Georgia, how he responds to everything, and if he can keep them in the game. I don't think much of us are expecting a win from Auburn here, but if you can keep them in the game and make this game fun like it always is, it'll be very interesting to see what that quarterback situation looks like after these 2 weeks, because a lot rides on it for Peyton Thorne, that's for sure. Another SEC matchup, Missouri at A&M. This is very interesting for a number of reasons. Missouri and A&M, in my mind, are kind of in that same group in the SEC where they're right behind the front of the pack, whether that's, Texas and Georgia to you alone, or that's Texas, Georgia, Ole Miss, Alabama. And then there's a group of teams, Tennessee, Missouri, A&M, Kentucky, that all could make noise. Let's call them the lurkers. The teams right behind the big boys that could absolutely make some noise. And I think this game will be huge. And then Brady Cook against A&M and the 12th man. We know how crazy that atmosphere can get. And Kyle Field. So if Brady Cook can roll in there and be ice cold and get a win for Missouri, then I think a lot of people would be looking at Missouri as not only a team that was good last year and will fade off into the sunset, but a team that is here to stay. So very excited to see what happens with that game. And then what might be the main event of this week, Clemson at Florida State. This is the game for the ACC. Pretty much cut and dry. This is the two teams that everyone thinks is going to be setting the pace, who I think is going to be setting the pace in the ACC, and this might be the game that decides who is the 1 seed or the 2 seed going into that game. It might just decide who gets into the game with not everyone playing each other. It gets a little bit more sketchy if you lose this game. Obviously, Florida State was able to walk into Clemson and get an overtime win last year. thanks to some ridiculous plays from Keon Coleman down the stretch of that one. But Florida State, they can assert their dominance over the ACC with another win over Clemson. Clemson could get back up to the top with a win over Florida State. So this one is going to be must-see television. I'm sure it will be under the lights in Doak Campbell, and I just cannot wait for that one. Another couple of very interesting ones is Miami heading to Cal. Not the most interesting game at face value, but maybe the longest trip anyone has ever made for a conference game. Absolutely insane that they're doing this. But it's the new reality we live in. And then Texas Tech at Arizona is a game that I think Arizona likely is a notch above Texas Tech, but Texas Tech is a very dangerous team, and if they were able to win this game, I think they would put themselves right into the thick of the things in the Big 12. So tons of really good games is basically the way to put this. This is the time of year where every game feels like life and death. Every game feels so important, and you really get to see who fits where, who is head and shoulders above everyone, who is in the different tiers in college football, and where everyone falls. So I cannot wait for the season. Every time I get to see the schedule and get to imagine the games that we get to watch, I get all excited inside. So it's always fun to talk about these games. But for the time being, we are going to take our last break of the show, and when we come back, we're going to do another Spotlight Wednesday, and today it is about the Utah Utes. They are moving over to the Big 12, obviously a big talking point, but the biggest talking point is obviously something that we'll get into after the break. There is a big thing that their season essentially all rides on, so stick with us, and we will be right back. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the big time games to watch in Week 5 and Week 6 of the 2024 season, and now it's time for Spotlight Wednesday, and today it is all about the Utah Utes, and when you talk about the Utah Utes, all you have to talk about really is Cam Rising, and can he stay healthy? That is what this season will be defined by. That's what this season will come down to. I think we all understand that both Bryson Barnes and Nate Johnson have transferred out of the program for obvious reasons with Cam Rising coming back. So there's no safety net. There's no longer these two guys that have starting experience that you know you can go to and at least play good football. There is a little bit of a bottoming out after Cam Rising, so his health is absolutely paramount. But Kyle Whittingham is one of the best coaches in the country. I had him, I believe, at 9 in my rankings of the top 10 coaches. If you want to go check that out and tear apart my top 10, you're more than welcome to. But he's someone that gets the best out of all of his players. He obviously does not have the best talent to work with in the country. Utah is quite far down on that list, but he always has really, really good teams. But they are losing a ton of really big-time players to the portal, to the next level, to whatever. So on the offensive side of the ball, Jaquindon Jackson, the really, really good running back that did have some injury troubles throughout the year, but was still a big part of that offense, has transferred to Arkansas. So some guys are going to have to step up in the backfield like they did a year ago. Devon Vele, the electric wide receiver, that was a huge part of that offense and a huge reason why they stayed afloat last year. is heading off to the next level. So some big holes to fill at skill positions on the offensive side of the ball, but defense is really where they get hit the hardest. Sione Vake, who also played offense, so I guess that's a double hit on both sides of the ball, and then Cole Bishop on the back end of that defense. Both really, really good safeties that made every smart play when they needed to make it. So that's not necessarily something that you come by very easily. It's not something that is taken for granted by any means. But both those guys off to the next level. And then edge rusher Jonah Ellis was an absolute game wrecker. He changed so many games for that team, kept them in a ton of games that maybe they shouldn't have been in. So he's someone that is absolutely maybe impossible to fully replace, but you can recreate him, as they said in Moneyball. You're not going to replace him with one guy, but you might be able to replace him with 3 or 4. So it'll be interesting to see how they develop that. But this team does bring back a ton of guys. They bring back a ton of veteran leadership that will help them immensely going into the Big 12. And Cam Rising is obvious. He's the number one guy. He is the vocal leader. He is the spiritual leader. He is everything for this team. But the two guys next to him, Micah Bernard and Jalen Glover at the running back position, are very, very good running backs. They stepped in huge when Jaquindon Jackson went down a number of times last season and played some big-time snaps and are really, really good running backs, kind of different styles as well, which always can help an offense. So two guys that, although you're losing probably your best running back in Jaquindon Jackson, Micah Bernard is not too far behind him by any means. And Jalen Glover might honestly be the most talented of the group. He just is a little bit younger. So I'm very excited to see what he can do. And the O-line returns a ton of talent. There are a ton of guys that, whether they're redshirt freshmen that are starting to get their chance or older guys that are more experienced. Kyle Whittingham is always going to have a good offensive line. They're always going to be really tough at the point of attack, so I'm not super worried about them. They have tons of talent there, and if you can protect Cam Rising, that is, there's a ton that can go right for this offense, that's for sure. Another couple of guys on offense that are going to be just huge are transfers Tayshawn Lyons from Washington and Dorian Singer, especially from USC. Them going along with Money Parks is really a formidable trio, a trio that honestly would rival any other one in the Big 12, might be the best in the Big 12. So tons of talent at that wide receiver position. Obviously, bringing in transfers is a little bit of a hit or miss proposition, but still tons to look forward to at that position where they haven't necessarily had the top-end talent in the past. So with Dorian Singer, now you really have it because the dude can really play. And then the back end of that defense is facing, obviously, Sione Vake and Cole Bishop leaving. Teo Johnson is the guy. He is going to be the leader of this back end, maybe the leader of this entire defense. He's moving to free safety after playing last year at nickel, where he started, I think, every game, maybe only 12 of 13, but a ton of games, has a ton of experience under his belt, and is just a remarkable player. They also have Gilman at safety, who's going to be huge. He was a transfer over from Stanford who played a ton of ball, so he's someone that could definitely step in. And then Cameron Calhoun, a guy that came over from Michigan at corner, will definitely have to be an immediate impact player because this back end, losing those two incredible safeties affects a lot more than just the safety position. So you're going to need as many good corners, as many good nickels, as many good back-end players, really, as you can get your hands on if you're Utah. So maybe they go back into the portal after spring, I don't know, but as of right now, that's what their back-end looks like, and they'll need some guys to really, really step up. But at the end of the day, when I look at this defense, they're losing a lot of guys. They're going to have to, make some things work, but I've given up on trying to act like Kyle Whittingham and Morgan Scaley are not going to put together a really, really good defense. They always have a defense that plays really fast, really aggressive, really physical, so I'm not going to question that. I think they will be more than fine on the defensive side of the ball. I think both these guys are just remarkable developers at pretty much every position. They have a really good staff over there, so I'm not necessarily worried about the defensive side of the ball, and I'm not overly worried about the offensive side of the ball. If you look at it on paper, there is a ton of talent on that team. Cam Rising obviously leading the way. If he can put the ball where it needs to be, when it needs to be, a phrase I feel like I've said 10 different times in this hour, everything's going to be great for this offense. They have two really good running backs. They have tons of wide receivers to throw to. They have good tight ends. They have a good offensive line. So they should be okay if Cam Rising can stay healthy. That's really the inflection point of this entire season, of this entire team, and of a lot of different things for Utah football, because if the health goes poorly again this year and he's not able to play the entire season and your team kind of bottoms out, that is a bad year for that to happen, because first year in the Big 12, you want to be able to set a precedent that you are one of the big time teams in this conference. It helps you with recruiting. It helps you with everything. So if they were to go 8-4 in their first year and kind of set them back a little bit, I think it could affect how people look at Utah going forward and how maybe some transfers look at Utah going forward. So this is a big year, no doubt about it, and Cam Rising staying healthy is huge. Obviously, the 2 years that he was healthy at Utah, Pac-12 titles. The 1 year that he was not, 8-5. So a very big difference between those two things, and you just got to hope that he's healthy. But let's jump into the schedule really quickly, because it's obviously a little bit different. They start with an easy win over Southern Utah, and then they jump right into Big 12 play. They get Baylor coming to Utah to face off against them. Should be a win for them, especially getting it at home, but that definitely will be a very interesting game and definitely will show us a lot about what Utah can bring to the Big 12 this upcoming year. Then they play Utah State at Utah State. Never a good idea to play a team that is a solid team like Utah State or App State at App State, or basically Tulane at Tulane. Don't play these teams at their homes. Make them come to you, because the second you go away from your home, things get a little bit more sketchy. So that's definitely a game to watch. And then they have the first road trip as a Big 12 member to Oklahoma State. And I just hope it's not a night game for their sake, because Boone Pickens at night is an absolute nightmare. It's a great environment regardless, but especially at night, it is just insane. As a lot of you know, that sky is just a little bit darker than most skies. I don't know how they do that, but it is quite the scene at Boone Pickens at night. And then back home for a huge one against Arizona, one that is going to set a lot of narratives, a lot of the hierarchy in the Big 12 this year will definitely be defined by that game a lot. And then they finally get a bye. And after the bye, they have 3 games that they should win in Arizona State, TCU at home, and then at Houston. 3 games that likely are wins on the schedule right now, but a lot of stuff can happen. So it'll be interesting to see what team they are by that time and where they sit in the Big 12 and how they take care of business in those. And then the final 4 games after the bye are kind of interesting. BYU at home should be a win, but BYU has a ton of unknowns, so we will figure out a lot more about them throughout the season coming up to this point. Then they go to Boulder to take on Colorado, and that's the scary one. That's the one that could get a little bit sketchy for them if they're not careful, because as we know, Colorado's got talent. They're not hurting for talent by any means, so that could be a sneaky one. And then Iowa State at home to finish off the season is really interesting. I think Utah will absolutely be favored in that game, but Iowa State's very sneaky. We talked about Rocco Becht yesterday. He is someone that could definitely throw a wrench into the works for some of these Big 12 teams, and I think he's someone that I really like and could really ruin Utah's season at the end of it right there. And then they go down to Orlando, all the way down to Orlando, to play UCF, which will be very, very interesting. I think they should win that game, but again, Gus Malzahn is a tricky bastard, and is someone that I shouldn't have said bastard there. I apologize. He is a tricky guy, and he is someone that could definitely get a big time upset if they're not careful in that game. So tons of things to watch for this Utah team. They should be at the forefront of the Big 12 this upcoming year, and the health is really the important part. If Cam Rising is on the field, I feel very good about him. If he's not, I don't feel quite as great about them. So it'll be very interesting to see what they can do. They could definitely meet Kansas State for a spot in the playoff in Dallas. So it'll be very interesting to see how all of this kind of unfolds. I'm very happy we get to see Kyle Whittingham possibly on the big stage in the playoffs. So very excited to see what happens there. But for now, that will do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast presented by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It makes a huge difference for us. Also, we invite you to follow us on Facebook or X, TikTok, Instagram, all of the different apps to get all of the content and updates. We have tons of people doing incredible work across pretty much every sport you could think of. So definitely check out all of those. Again, apologies for my potty mouth a second ago. Definitely shouldn't have done that. I do apologize. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, and I will see you guys tomorrow.